The sky over Cedar Hollow turned the color of a blacksmith's forge on the night Milton Warren rode back into the town that had once cast him out. And he did not come for revenge, nor for gold, nor for anything a man might reasonably expect. He came because word had reached him on the trail, carried by a half-drunk drifter at a lonely way station, that Margaret Kingsley's town was burning, and that was the only word he needed to spur his horse into a gallop that would nearly kill the animal beneath him. It was the autumn of 1878, and the high plains of the Wyoming territory had turned gold and brittle with the coming cold. Milton had spent the better part of 6 years drifting between cattle drives and mining camps, taking work where he found it, and losing himself in the vastness of the frontier, all in an effort to forget a woman who had told him, with tears standing unshed in her eyes, that she could not marry a man with no name and no land to offer her. He had not blamed her for it then, not truly, though the wound of it had never fully closed. He blamed the world instead, the hard, unfair shape of it, the way a woman's future could be measured in acres and cattle rather than in the size of a man's heart. But hearts, Milton had come to understand somewhere between the Dakotas and the Cheyenne Trail, did not forget so easily as pride wished they would. He had heard, over the years, scattered pieces of her life, the way a man hears distant thunder before a storm arrives. She had married a rancher named Thomas Kingsley, a man 20 years her senior who owned half the grazing land around Cedar Hollow, and Milton had told himself that was the end of it, that Margaret Kingsley belonged now to a different life entirely, one with a name and land and respectability, everything he had once lacked. Then 2 years passed. Word had drifted to him that Thomas Kingsley had died of a fever, leaving Margaret a widow with a modest inheritance and a young daughter to raise alone. Milton had sat with that news for a long while beside a campfire in the Bighorn foothills, turning it over like a stone in his palm, wondering if fate was teasing him or testing him. He had not gone to her. Pride, that old familiar enemy, had kept him away. A man did not ride back into a woman's life simply because her circumstances had changed, he told himself. That would make him no better than a vulture circling a wounded thing. So he had stayed away, working a modest spread he had finally managed to buy for himself in the Powder River country, tending cattle and building fences, and telling himself he had made peace with the shape his life had taken. Peace, it turned out, was a lie a man told himself in the daylight hours, only to have it shatter the moment real news arrived. The drifter at the way station had said the words plainly, without understanding the weight they carried. Cedar Hollow's caught fire, mister. Whole Main Street's ablaze, on account of some fool knocking a lantern into a hay wagon outside the mercantile. Word is half the town's trying to get the animals out, and the other half's just trying to save their own skins. Heard tell the widow Kingsley's place is right in the path of it, on account of her boarding house sitting near the feed store where the fire started. Milton had not waited to hear more. He had thrown $2 at the station keeper for a fresh horse, a rangy chestnut gelding with more heart than sense, and he had ridden through the night and half the following day, pushing the animal harder than any decent man should push a horse, because somewhere in Cedar Hollow, Margaret Kingsley might be standing between her daughter and a wall of flame, and Milton Warren could not live with himself if he arrived too late to matter. The town came into view as the sun was beginning its slow collapse toward the western ridgeline, and even from 2 miles out, Milton could see the smoke rising black and furious against the burnt orange sky, a great smudging column that seemed to swallow the very color from the heavens. His stomach turned to lead. He had seen prairie fires before, had watched grass burn for miles in a summer drought, but this was different. This was a town, wooden buildings packed close together along a single dusty street, tinder waiting for a spark, and now that spark had found it. He drove his heels into the chestnut's flanks and did not ease up until the animal's sides were heaving and foam had gathered white at its mouth, and even then he did not fully ease up, only enough to keep the poor beast from collapsing beneath him before he reached the edge of town. Cedar Hollow, when he finally rode into it, was a vision from some nightmare told around a dying campfire. The feed store was already a smoking ruin, its roof caved inward, black timbers jutting up like the ribs of some great dead animal. The flames had leapt from there to the mercantile beside it, and from the mercantile the fire was crawling, hungry and relentless, toward the row of buildings that made up the rest of the main street. Among them, Milton knew with a sick certainty, the boarding house that Margaret Kingsley had run since her husband's death. Men and women ran through the smoke-choked street carrying buckets from the town well, forming ragged lines, throwing water that seemed pitifully small against the roaring orange beast consuming their homes. A church bell was ringing somewhere, frantic and uneven, as though the man pulling the rope could not decide whether to keep ringing or run for his own life. Horses screamed in a corral near the livery, panicked by the smoke, and Milton saw two men struggling to open the gate and drive them clear before the fire reached them. He did not stop to help with the buckets, though every instinct in him wanted to. He had one purpose only, burned into him with the same fierce heat as the flames themselves, and that purpose had a name: Margaret. He swung down from the exhausted chestnut in front of what he recognized, even through the haze of smoke, as the Kingsley boarding house, a two-story clapboard building with a wraparound porch that Margaret had once told him, back when they were young and full of dreams neither of them yet understood as fragile, she would love to own someday. Fate, cruel and strange, had given her that very house, and now fate seemed intent on taking it from her in fire. The front windows glowed with an angry orange light from within, and smoke was already curling out from beneath the eaves of the roof. Milton did not hesitate. He tore his bandana from around his neck, soaked it hurriedly in a nearby horse trough, tied it over his nose and mouth, and ran for the door. "Margaret!" he shouted, his voice cracking against the roar of the fire and the shouts of the townspeople behind him. "Margaret Kingsley!" There was no answer from within, only the crackling groan of old wood surrendering to flame. Milton kicked the door open, since the handle had already grown too hot to touch, and smoke rolled out over him in a thick gray wave that stung his eyes to instant tears and set his lungs burning even through the wet cloth. He pressed forward anyway, staying low, remembering some half-forgotten wisdom from a cattle camp fire years before that smoke rises, and a man crawling near the floor might yet find air worth breathing. The front parlor was already engulfed along one wall, flames licking up curtains that had once been cheerful yellow gingham, now curling black and dropping in flaming scraps to the floor. "Margaret!" he called again, and this time, faint and desperate, he heard it. "Up here. We're trapped, the stairs are burning." Her voice. After 6 years, after all the miles and all the silence, Milton Warren heard Margaret Kingsley's voice again, and it very nearly broke something loose in his chest, even as terror for her safety eclipsed every other feeling. He found the staircase, or what remained passable of it, flames already devouring the lower steps and creeping upward with terrible speed. Through the smoke he could just make out a small figure at the top of the stairs, a woman in a soot-streaked dress, and clinging to her skirts, a little girl no older than 6, her face white with fear. "Margaret, get back from the edge, I am coming up," Milton shouted, and without waiting for her reply, without truly weighing whether the burning steps would bear his weight, he began to climb, testing each stair as best he could in the chaos, feeling the heat scorch through the soles of his boots. Halfway up, a step gave way beneath him with a groan of collapsing wood, and he lunged forward, catching the banister with both hands, hauling himself up and over the gap by main strength alone, his shoulder screaming in protest at the sudden violent pull. He did not stop to consider the pain. He kept climbing until he reached the top, where Margaret Kingsley stood with her daughter pressed against her, both of them coughing, both of them terrified, and for one strange suspended moment, even amid all that chaos and heat and roaring destruction, their eyes met, and 6 years dissolved as though they had never passed at all. "Milton," she said, and there was such disbelief in her voice, such raw astonishment layered over the fear, that for a heartbeat neither of them moved. "Milton Warren. How can you possibly be here?" "There is no time for that now," he said, though his own heart was hammering with far more than the exertion of the climb. "We have to get you both out. Is there another way down, a back stair, anything?" "The back stairs are already burning too, I tried," Margaret said, her voice trembling but her eyes clear and steady despite the fear in them, the same steadiness he remembered from years before, the kind of courage that did not announce itself but simply endured. "There is a window at the end of the hall that looks out over the porch roof. I thought perhaps we could climb out onto it, but it is a long drop from there to the ground, and Charlotte is so small." Charlotte. Her daughter's name, spoken for the first time in Milton's hearing, and something in him softened even in the midst of the crisis, some tenderness reaching out instinctively toward the frightened child. "Show me," he said. "We do not have much time." She led him down the smoke-filled hallway, one hand pressed over her daughter's mouth and nose with a handkerchief, coughing herself despite it, and Milton followed close behind, feeling the heat building at his back as the fire consumed the stairwell they had just left. They reached the window at the end of the hall, and Milton wrenched it open, the old wood swollen and stubborn, forcing it up with a grunt of effort until at last it gave way and cool evening air rushed in, a shocking relief after the suffocating heat within. Below them, the porch roof sloped away, and beyond that, a drop of perhaps 12 feet to the packed earth of the yard. Not an impossible distance for a grown man to manage, but for a small child, and for a woman in skirts, it was treacherous enough to make Milton's stomach clench. "I will go down first and catch Charlotte when you lower her," he said, already climbing out onto the porch roof, feeling the shingles shift dangerously beneath his boots. "Margaret, can you manage to hand her down to me?" "Yes," Margaret said, though her voice shook. "Yes, I can do that." Milton lowered himself carefully down the sloped roof, using the porch post to steady his descent until he stood upon it, straddling the narrow ledge, and then he swung himself down to hang from the edge before dropping the remaining distance to the ground below, his knees absorbing the impact with a jolt that rattled up through his spine. He turned immediately, arms already raised. "Now, Margaret, bring her to the edge." Margaret appeared at the window with Charlotte clutched against her, and Milton watched as she guided the girl out onto the porch roof, holding tight to her small hands, walking her carefully down the slope until they reached the edge. "Charlotte, sweetheart, I need you to be very brave," Margaret said, her voice steady now despite everything, the voice of a mother finding strength she had not known she possessed. "This man is going to catch you. You must jump when I tell you to." The girl's eyes, wide and dark with terror, found Milton standing below with his arms outstretched, and something in his steady gaze must have reassured her, for she nodded, small and fierce. "Jump now, Charlotte," Margaret said, and the girl leapt. Milton caught her cleanly, the small weight of her nearly nothing against the adrenaline coursing through him, and he set her down quickly, turning back to the roof where Margaret still stood, smoke now pouring out the window behind her in thick black ribbons. "Margaret, your turn, hurry." She climbed down the same path her daughter had taken, moving with less grace but no less determination, and when she reached the edge, she did not hesitate the way Milton half expected a proper widow might, worried about modesty or decorum in front of a man she had once refused. She simply jumped, trusting him without question, and he caught her against his chest, her weight driving him back a step before he steadied them both. For one long moment, they stood there in the yard behind the burning boarding house, Margaret held against him, her heart pounding visibly beneath her soot-streaked dress, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and Milton found he could not release her immediately, some part of him needing to simply feel that she was real, that she was safe, that 6 years of separation and an entire marriage to another man had not erased the fact of who she was to him. "We have to move away from the building," he said finally, forcing himself to set her properly on her feet. The whole structure could come down at any moment. They hurried, the three of them, Charlotte's small hand gripped tight in her mother's, around to the front of the property and out into the street, where the fire brigade of townspeople had, at least for now, managed to keep the flames from spreading further down the row of buildings. Though the boarding house itself, along with the feed store and mercantile, was clearly beyond saving. Margaret stopped in the middle of the dusty street, staring back at the house that had been her home, watching the flames consume the porch they had just escaped, watching the roof begin to sag and buckle. Milton saw the moment her composure finally cracked, saw the tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks, and he did not think, only acted, drawing her against his shoulder as she wept, while Charlotte clung to her mother's skirts and stared at the fire with the blank shock of a child who has seen more in one evening than any child ought to see. "It is only a house," Milton said quietly, his voice rough with smoke and something else besides. "You are alive. Charlotte is alive. That is what matters." "Everything I built since Thomas died," Margaret said against his shoulder, her voice muffled and broken. "Every bit of it gone." "Not everything," Milton said. "You are still standing. That is not nothing, Margaret. That is not nothing at all." She pulled back enough to look at him then, her eyes red-rimmed and searching his face as though trying to reconcile the man before her with the memory she had carried for 6 years, and Milton felt the weight of that searching gaze settle somewhere deep in his chest. "How did you know to come?" she asked. "How did you even hear?" "A drifter passing through the way station where I keep my horses fresh," Milton said. He mentioned Cedar Hollow was burning, and mentioned the widow Kingsley's place besides. "I did not stop to think on it, Margaret. I simply rode." "You rode 2 days," she said, understanding dawning slowly in her expression. "You rode 2 days without stopping on the strength of a stranger's careless mention." "I would have ridden 4 days," Milton said simply, "if that was what it took." Around them, the fire brigade continued its desperate work, and a man Milton did not recognize, broad-shouldered and soot-blackened, his shirt sleeves rolled up past the elbow, called out across the chaos for more hands at the bucket line, and Milton knew he could not simply stand there holding a conversation, however much his heart demanded it, while the town still burned. "I have to help them," he said. "Will you be safe here, the 2 of you, if I go?" Margaret nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand, some of her old strength returning to her posture. "Yes, go. There is nothing more urgent than stopping that fire before it takes the whole street." Milton found the bucket line and joined it, working alongside men he had never met, passing heavy pails of water hand to hand from the well toward the row of buildings still standing, throwing what they could against walls and roofs that had not yet caught, while the wind, mercifully, seemed to be dying with the coming of full evening, robbing the flames of the fuel they needed to leap further down the street. It took nearly 2 more hours of grueling, smoke-choked labor before the fire brigade could say with any confidence that the worst had passed, that the flames had been contained to the feed store, the mercantile, and the boarding house, 3 buildings reduced to smoking ruin, but the rest of Cedar Hollow's main street spared. Milton's hands were blistered from the rough wooden buckets, his eyes stung raw, his throat felt scraped hollow from smoke, but none of that mattered against the simple fact that Margaret Kingsley and her daughter were alive, and the town, battered and grieving though it was, would survive to rebuild. He found Margaret again near the edge of town, where the townspeople had gathered the displaced families, women bringing out blankets and what food could be spared, children huddled together in the cool night air, while the adults spoke in low, shocked voices about all that had been lost. Charlotte had fallen asleep against her mother's side, exhaustion finally overtaking fear, and Margaret sat with her arm curled protectively around the girl, staring at nothing in particular until she noticed Milton approaching, soot-blackened and limping slightly from a twisted ankle he had not even noticed until the adrenaline began to fade. "You are hurt," she said immediately, starting to rise. "It is nothing, only a strain," Milton said, waving her back down. "How is Charlotte?" "Frightened but unharmed," Margaret said. "She breathed in more smoke than I would like, but the doctor looked her over and says she will mend with rest." "And you?" "I will mend too," Margaret said, though something in her voice suggested the mending would take longer than a night's rest could provide, that the loss of her home and her livelihood was a wound that would linger. "Milton, I do not know how to thank you properly for what you did tonight. You saved both our lives. I am not certain I would have found a way out on my own." "You do not need to thank me," Milton said, lowering himself carefully to sit on the ground nearby, his ankle protesting the movement. "I only did what any decent person would have done in my place." "That is not true, and you know it is not," Margaret said, and there was an edge of something fierce in her voice now, something that had been building perhaps since the moment their eyes first met on that burning staircase. "Any decent person might have tried to help, yes, but you rode 2 days on a borrowed horse the moment you heard my name mentioned by a stranger. That is not the action of a mere decent person, Milton Warren. That is something else entirely, and I think we both know it." Milton did not answer immediately, watching the last stubborn flames flicker and die among the ruins of the feed store across the way, watching the smoke drift up gray and thinning against a sky now sprinkled with the first stars of full night. "I never stopped thinking of you," he said finally, quietly, the words coming out rougher than he intended, worn raw by smoke and old grief both. "I told myself I had over the years. I told myself a man cannot spend his whole life pining after a woman who made her choice plainly enough. But then word came that you were widowed, and I found I could not stop thinking of you at all. And then tonight, when I heard your town was burning, I did not have to think on it even for a moment. I simply rode." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her hand moving gently through her sleeping daughter's hair, and when she spoke again, her voice was smaller than before, stripped of its earlier fierceness, replaced instead with something more vulnerable. "I have thought of you too, Milton, more than I ever admitted even to myself. When I refused you all those years ago, I told myself I was being practical, that a woman alone on the frontier cannot afford to marry for feeling alone, that she must think of security, of a future that will not collapse beneath her the moment hardship arrives. I told myself I was being wise, but I do not think I have felt truly wise about that choice, not once, not in all the years since." "You do not owe me any explanation," Milton said, though the words she had spoken settled into him like water into dry ground, soaking through old cracks he had thought long sealed. "You made the choice that seemed right to you at the time. I do not hold it against you, Margaret. I never did, not truly, not even in my most bitter moments. Perhaps I owe myself the explanation more than I owe it to you," Margaret said softly. "I married Thomas because he was steady, because he had land and a good name in this territory, because I believed those things would keep Charlotte and myself safe in a way that love alone could not. And he was a good man, Milton. I will not speak ill of him. He never once raised his hand or his voice to me in anger, and he provided well for us both. But I do not think I ever loved him the way a wife ought to love a husband. I think some part of me always wondered what might have become of me had I chosen differently." Milton felt something tighten in his chest at her words, a complicated tangle of grief for what might have been and something dangerously close to hope for what still might be. "Margaret," he said carefully, "I do not think this is the night to speak of such things. You have lost your home, your daughter is exhausted, and the whole town is reeling from what has happened. Whatever exists between us, it will keep. It has kept for 6 years already. It can keep a little longer while we see to what is needed now." She looked at him for a long moment, something soft and grateful in her expression, and nodded slowly. "You are right, of course, practical as ever even now." "Not always practical," Milton said, allowing himself the smallest smile despite the exhaustion weighing on every part of him. "Only tonight perhaps when it matters most." The following days in Cedar Hollow passed in the particular blur that follows any great calamity, the townspeople picking through the wreckage of the burned buildings, salvaging what could be salvaged, mourning what could not, and slowly, methodically, beginning the long work of rebuilding. Milton found himself unable to simply ride away and leave Margaret and Charlotte to manage alone, And so he stayed, taking a room at the town's other boarding house, the one that had survived the fire untouched, and offering his labor freely to whatever tasks needed doing. He helped clear the burned timber from the boarding house lot, working alongside a rotating crew of townsmen, who, once they learned of his role in the rescue of Margaret and her daughter, treated him with a warm respect that surprised him, given how coolly Cedar Hollow had regarded him 6 years before, when he had been nothing more than a landless drifter courting the daughter of a modest but respectable family. It seemed the fire had burned away more than buildings, had burned away some of the old rigid judgments too. Or perhaps it was simply that a man who rode 2 days to save a woman and her child earned himself a different reputation than the one he had left behind. The town's mayor, a heavy-set man named Elias Frost, who had lost his own hardware store to the flames, though he bore the loss with a philosophical calm that impressed Milton, organized a town meeting in the church, the largest building left standing that could hold a gathering of any size, to discuss the rebuilding effort and how the town might pool its resources to help those who had lost the most. "We have lost buildings," Elias Frost said, standing at the front of the church with his thumbs hooked into his suspenders, addressing the crowded pews. "But we have not lost our community, and that, friends, is the thing that matters most. I propose we form a rebuilding committee, and I propose further that we look to those among us who have shown themselves capable and willing to do the hard work such a task requires." He looked, as he said this, directly at Milton, who sat near the back of the church beside Margaret and Charlotte, and Milton felt a flush of something unfamiliar rise in him, a kind of belonging he had not expected to find again in Cedar Hollow. "Mr. Warren has already proven himself more than willing," Elias Frost continued. "I would ask him to serve on the committee if he is willing to extend his stay in our town a while longer." Milton glanced at Margaret before answering, some silent question passing between them, and when she gave the smallest nod, he cleared his throat and rose to his feet. "I would be glad to help in whatever way is useful," he said. "This town took me in once, briefly, some years back, and though things did not end easily for me then, I do not hold grudges against a place for the hard turns of a young man's fortune. I will stay and help rebuild gladly." There was a murmur of approval through the church, and Margaret, sitting beside him, reached over and briefly squeezed his hand where it rested on his knee, a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes given how carefully they had both been guarding the space between them since that first emotional night. In the weeks that followed, Milton threw himself into the work of rebuilding Cedar Hollow with the same fierce determination he had shown riding into the burning town, and slowly, board by board, nail by nail, the skeleton of a new mercantile began to rise where the old one had stood, and beside it, the frame of a new feed store, and further down, on the lot where the boarding house had burned, the beginnings of a new structure that Margaret had decided. After much careful consideration of her modest savings and the small insurance payment she had received from a policy her late husband had wisely purchased, she would rebuild, though smaller and more sensible than before. Milton found himself spending increasing amounts of time in Margaret's company during this period, not merely through the necessity of the rebuilding work, though that certainly brought them together often enough, but through 100 small moments that accumulated like grains of sand into something substantial. He walked her and Charlotte to church on Sunday mornings, since the temporary lodgings she had taken were on his way regardless. He brought Charlotte small carved wooden toys he whittled himself in the evenings, a horse, a dog, once a small articulated bird whose wings could be made to flap by pulling a string, and the girls' delighted laughter at these gifts warmed something in Milton that had gone cold and quiet for years. One evening in late October, with the rebuilding of the boarding house perhaps a third complete, its skeletal frame standing pale against the darkening sky, Milton found Margaret sitting alone on an overturned crate near the construction site, watching the sunset paint the raw new timber in shades of amber and rose. "You should be resting," he said, settling onto a neighboring crate without waiting to be invited, a familiarity that had grown naturally between them over the preceding weeks. "You have been on your feet since dawn, organizing the linens the church ladies collected." "I find I cannot rest easily these days," Margaret said. "There is too much to think about. The rebuilding, Charlotte's schooling, which has been disrupted by all of this, and other things besides." "What other things?" She was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky, and when she spoke, her voice carried a careful weight, as though she had rehearsed the words many times before allowing herself to speak them aloud. "I have been thinking of the choice I made 6 years ago, Milton, and of the choice that stands before me now." Milton's heart quickened, though he kept his voice carefully even. "What choice is that?" "You know very well what choice," Margaret said, turning to look at him directly, her eyes catching the last of the sunset's light. "I refused you once because I believed a woman alone could not survive on love alone, that she needed security and standing in the world. I was young and frightened, and perhaps not entirely wrong in the reasoning, given how precarious life on this frontier can be for a woman without means. But I am not that same frightened girl any longer, Milton. I have buried a husband. I have raised a daughter through hardship. I have watched my home burn to the ground and found the strength to begin rebuilding it with my own 2 hands, alongside the help of good neighbors and a good man who did not have to come back to this town at all, and yet did." "Margaret," Milton said softly, "what are you saying?" "I am saying that I do not want to make the same mistake twice," she said, her voice trembling slightly now despite her evident effort to keep it steady. "I am saying that if you still feel for me even a fraction of what I believe you rode 2 days to prove you feel, then I do not wish to let pride or fear or old habits stand between us any longer. I have had enough of practical choices made from fear. I find I would rather choose, for once in my life, from love alone, and trust that the practical matters will sort themselves out as they will." Milton reached across the space between the 2 crates and took her hand in both of his, feeling the roughness of her palm from weeks of hard labor alongside her neighbor's, a texture that spoke of resilience rather than the soft delicacy he remembered from years before, and somehow that change made him love her all the more. "I never stopped feeling for you, Margaret," he said. "Not for one single day in 6 years. I told myself many lies to make the ache of it bearable, but the feeling itself, that never once wavered. If you will have me, truly have me, I would be the proudest man in this territory to call myself your husband." Margaret's breath caught and tears gathered in her eyes, though she was smiling now, a smile Milton had not seen from her since long before her marriage to Thomas Kingsley, wide and unguarded and utterly without calculation. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Milton, I will have you. I should have said yes 6 years ago, and I have regretted the refusal more times than I could ever properly count, but I am saying yes now, and I mean it with every part of myself." He kissed her then, there among the rising timber of her half-built home, with the last light of the sunset fading into the deep blue of early evening and the first stars beginning to prick through overhead. And it was a kiss 6 years in the making, careful at first, and then deepening as the years of longing on both sides finally found their release. And when they parted, both of them were laughing softly, giddy with the sheer relief and joy of a wound so long carried finally beginning to heal. "We should tell Charlotte," Margaret said, still smiling, wiping happy tears from her cheeks. "She has grown fond of you already, Milton. I think she will be pleased." "I hope so," Milton said. "I have grown fond of her too, more than fond if I am honest. I have thought these past weeks of what it might be to be a father to her, and the thought does not frighten me the way I once believed such a thought might. It settles something in me instead." They found Charlotte at the temporary lodgings, sitting at a small table working diligently on a sampler her mother had set her to stitching as a way of passing the disrupted days. And when Margaret knelt beside her daughter and explained, in simple, gentle terms, that Milton would be joining their family, that he would become her stepfather if the girl was willing to have him. Charlotte's face broke into a wide, gap-toothed grin. "Will he still make me the wooden animals?" she asked, with the practical priorities of a 6-year-old. "I imagine he will make you a whole menagerie if you ask him nicely," Margaret said, laughing. "Then yes," Charlotte declared. "I would like that very much." The wedding took place in early December, in the newly rebuilt church that had been the first structure the town completed after the fire, a decision the townspeople had made deliberately, understanding that a community needed its house of worship restored before all else if it hoped to rebuild its spirit alongside its buildings. Snow had begun to dust the ground outside, the first real snow of the season, and it lent the whole affair a hushed, holy quality that Margaret would later say felt like a blessing on their union, the world itself pausing to mark the occasion with quiet beauty. Elias Frost, in his capacity as mayor and the closest thing Cedar Hollow had to an official presiding figure in the absence of a settled preacher, since the previous one had moved on after losing his own modest savings in the fire, performed the ceremony himself, reading from a well-worn Bible with genuine feeling despite his lack of formal ordination, and the whole town turned out to witness it, packing the pews and standing along the walls. For by now the story of Milton Warren riding 2 days to save the woman who had once refused his hand had spread through Cedar Hollow and the surrounding ranches like its own kind of wildfire, though this one warmed rather than destroyed. "Do you, Milton Warren," Elias Frost intoned, his voice carrying easily through the quiet church, "take Margaret Kingsley to be your lawful wife, to love and cherish her in times of plenty and in times of hardship, so long as you both shall live?" "I do," Milton said, and the words carried a weight far beyond their simplicity, 6 years of longing and one desperate ride through smoke and flame compressed into 2 small syllables. "And do you, Margaret Kingsley, take Milton Warren to be your lawful husband, to love and cherish him in times of plenty and in times of hardship, so long as you both shall live?" "I do," Margaret said, her voice clear and strong and utterly without hesitation, a stark contrast to the fear that had governed her choice 6 years before. "Then by the authority vested in me as mayor of this town, and by the grace of God who has seen fit to bring you together again after such trial, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Milton, you may kiss your bride." He did, and the church erupted in applause and cheerful shouting, and little Charlotte, standing beside her mother in a new dress the church ladies had helped sew for the occasion, clapped her small hands together with unrestrained delight. And somewhere in the back of the church, Milton noticed, an old rancher who had once told him plainly, 6 years before, that he would never amount to anything worth a decent woman's attention, was wiping unashamed tears from his weathered cheeks. The reception that followed was held in the half-finished boarding house, its frame now enclosed enough to provide shelter from the winter chill, though the interior still smelled faintly of fresh-cut lumber rather than the settled comfort of a finished home. The townspeople brought food in abundance, roasted meats and fresh bread and preserves put up from the last of the autumn harvest, and a fiddler struck up cheerful reels while couples danced in the open space that would eventually become the boarding house's front parlor. Milton danced with Margaret until both of them were breathless and laughing, and then he danced with Charlotte too, swinging the delighted girl in careful circles while the townspeople looked on with warm approval. And it struck him, in that moment, surrounded by people who had once been strangers or worse, cool judges of his worth, that he had somehow found his way not merely back to Margaret, but into a whole community that had chosen, in the wake of shared catastrophe, to welcome him fully as one of their own. "You look happier than I have ever seen you," Margaret said later, when the dancing had slowed and they stood together near the window, watching snow fall softly past the glass in the lamplight. "I am happier than I have ever been," Milton said. "I spent 6 years believing I had lost the one thing that could make me so. I do not intend to take a single day of this for granted, Margaret, not one." They spent that first winter together in the temporary lodgings, while the boarding house's rebuilding continued at a steadier pace now, no longer rushed by the desperate need for shelter, but proceeding with the careful attention a home deserves when it is being built to last. Milton sold his small spread in the Powder River country, a decision that surprised some of the ranchers who had known him there. But he had found that the land held no particular claim on his heart the way Cedar Hollow now did, the way Margaret and Charlotte did. And with the proceeds from that sale, he was able to contribute substantially to the completion of Margaret's boarding house, adding a wing that had not existed in the original structure, intended for a family that Milton hoped, in the quiet privacy of his own heart, might soon grow larger. He also purchased, with the remainder of his savings, a modest plot of grazing land just outside Cedar Hollow's boundaries, enough to run a small herd of cattle, not the grand ambitions of the great cattle barons whose spread stretched for thousands of acres across the territory, but enough to provide steady income and honest work, the kind of practical security that Margaret had once told him, all those years ago, she required from any man she would consider marrying. It pleased him deeply to be able to offer her that security now, not as the price of her hand, for she had already given that freely and without condition, but as a gift, a demonstration that the boy who had once had nothing to offer had grown into a man capable of building something worth having. The new boarding house was completed by early spring of 1879, a handsome two-story structure larger and sturdier than the one that had burned, with a wraparound porch just as Margaret had always dreamed of, and a sign above the door that read, in careful hand-painted letters that Milton himself had lettered with more patience than natural skill, Warren House, Margaret having insisted on the change of name to reflect the new family that would run it together. Business proved steady from the outset, for Cedar Hollow's rebuilding had drawn tradesmen and craftsmen from across the territory, all of them needing lodging while the work continued, and Margaret's reputation for a clean, well-run establishment, combined with the town's collective goodwill toward the family that had rebuilt so bravely after such loss, ensured the rooms rarely stood empty for long. Milton split his time between tending his small cattle herd and helping Margaret with the heavier maintenance work the boarding house demanded, and in the evenings, the family gathered in the kitchen for meals that Margaret prepared with a skill she had honed over years of necessity, and Charlotte would recite whatever she had learned that day at the small schoolhouse that had also been rebuilt, and Milton found himself, more often than not, simply watching them both with a quiet, disbelieving gratitude that this life, this ordinary, warm, contented life, had somehow become his own. By the summer of 1880, Margaret was carrying their first child together, a fact that filled the household with an anticipation Milton had not known he was capable of feeling, having spent so many years believing family and fatherhood were pleasures reserved for other luckier men. He built a cradle himself that summer, working the wood by lamplight after Margaret and Charlotte had gone to sleep, carving small decorative flourishes into the headboard, roses and vines that he remembered Margaret once admiring on a piece of furniture in her father's house, long before either of them had understood what they might one day mean to each other. The child, a son, arrived in early November of that year, during a mild spell of weather that the whole town remarked upon as a fortunate blessing, given how difficult the winter births could sometimes prove on the exposed plains. They named him Thomas, after Margaret's late husband, a decision Milton had suggested himself, understanding without needing to be told that Thomas Kingsley had been a good man who deserved to be remembered kindly, and that honoring his memory in their son's name was a gesture that would mean more to Margaret than perhaps any other gift Milton could offer her. "You are certain you do not mind?" Margaret had asked him when he first proposed the name, watching him carefully for any sign of jealousy or discomfort. "Thomas Kingsley gave you and Charlotte a good home when you needed one, and I understand that better than most men might," Milton said. "I do not begrudge the dead their due, Margaret. I only hope to be as good a father to this child as he was to Charlotte, in whatever ways our different circumstances allow. Charlotte, now 8 years old and fiercely proud of her new baby brother, took to the role of elder sibling with an enthusiasm that occasionally exhausted her mother, insisting on helping with every task related to the infant's care, from folding tiny garments to singing him to sleep with songs of her own invention, most of which involved a startling number of horses and only tangentially related lyrics about babies. Milton found himself, in those early months of fatherhood, marveling frequently at the strange turns his life had taken. He had ridden into Cedar Hollow that autumn night in 1878 believing he might arrive too late, believing the fire might have already claimed Margaret before he could reach her, and instead he had found, through that terrible crisis, not merely the chance to save her life, but the chance to rebuild an entire future alongside her, one he had believed lost to him forever 6 years before. The following spring, in 1881, Cedar Hollow held its annual Founding Day celebration, a tradition that had been suspended the previous 2 years while the town focused its energies on rebuilding after the fire, but which the townspeople now revived with particular enthusiasm, wanting to mark the occasion of the town's full recovery with proper festivity. There were foot races for the children, a horseshoe tournament for the men, a quilting competition among the women that Margaret entered with a piece she had been working on through the long winter evenings, and in the evening, a great communal supper laid out on long tables in the town square, followed by dancing that lasted well past dark. Elias Frost, who had been re-elected mayor twice more in the intervening years, stood to address the gathered townspeople before the evening's dancing began, and he spoke of the fire that had nearly destroyed their community, and of the resilience that had rebuilt it stronger than before. "I would be remiss," he said, his voice carrying across the town square in the warm evening air, "if I did not mention on this occasion the story that has become something of a legend in these parts, of a man who rode 2 days without rest to save a woman he had once loved and lost, and who found in the ashes of catastrophe the chance to build a life he had believed forever beyond his reach. Milton Warren, Margaret Warren, would you stand, please?" Milton and Margaret rose from their places at the long table, Margaret holding baby Thomas against her shoulder, Charlotte standing proudly between them, and the townspeople applauded warmly, many of them raising their cups in an impromptu toast. "This town has learned these past years that our fortunes can be reduced to ash in a single night," Elias Frost continued, "but that what truly makes a home, what truly makes a community, cannot be burned away so easily. Love, once it takes proper root, endures through whatever fire may come." I think there is no finer example of that truth among us than the story of these two, and I am glad, deeply glad, that we have all been witness to it. Milton, standing beside his wife with his daughter's hand in his and his infant son sleeping peacefully against Margaret's shoulder, felt his throat tighten with an emotion too large for easy words, and when he looked at Margaret, he found her eyes bright with tears of her own, though her smile was radiant despite them. "Thank you," Milton said simply, when the applause finally quieted enough for his voice to carry. "I only rode toward the thing I loved most in this world. I think most any man would have done the same, given the chance." "Not every man," someone called out from among the crowd, an old rancher's voice, gruff with sentiment, "would have ridden 2 days without rest to prove it." The laughter and warm agreement that followed carried the evening forward into dancing and celebration that lasted until the stars stood thick and bright overhead, and Milton, holding Margaret close as the fiddler played a slow waltz beneath the vast Wyoming sky, found himself thinking that whatever hardships the frontier had yet to offer them, whatever fires might yet threaten in the years to come, he would face them all willingly, so long as he faced them with her. 2 more years passed in the steady rhythm of frontier life, and Warren House prospered alongside the growing town, its rooms rarely empty, its dining room known throughout the territory for Margaret's cooking, which had only improved with the years and the addition of a proper kitchen stove that Milton had ordered special from a catalog, and hauled in himself from the railhead some 40 miles distant. Milton's small cattle herd had grown steadily too, aided by good grazing years and careful management, until he employed 2 hired hands to help with the work, young men grateful for steady employment and the kind of fair, patient guidance Milton offered them, having remembered well enough what it felt like to be a young man with more ambition than opportunity. In the spring of 1883, Margaret gave birth to a second child, a daughter this time, whom they named Rebecca, after Milton's own mother, who had passed away years before Milton had ever met Margaret, back when he had still been a boy in Missouri before the restless pull of the frontier had drawn him westward. Rebecca arrived with a full head of dark hair and a temperament far calmer than her elder brother Thomas had shown as an infant, and the household settled into the particular chaos and joy of raising 3 children spanning a decade in age, Charlotte now 11, and taking on ever more responsibility as the eldest, Thomas a rambunctious toddler of 2.5, and baby Rebecca content to observe the household's activity from whatever safe perch her mother or father provided. It was in the autumn of that same year, 5 years almost exactly since the night of the Great Fire, that Milton found himself standing once more on the porch of Warren House at sunset, watching the sky turn the same shades of gold and rose that had colored the evening he first proposed to Margaret among the raw timber of her rebuilding home. Margaret joined him there, Rebecca sleeping in her arms, and for a long while they simply stood together in comfortable silence, watching the light fade over the plains that had become, so improbably and so completely, their home. "Do you ever think of that night?" Margaret asked finally. "The fire, I mean." "I still dream of it sometimes, though the dreams have grown gentler with time." "I think of it often," Milton admitted, "not with the fear it once carried, but with a kind of gratitude I find difficult to properly express. That fire took your house, and it frightened us both nearly to death, but it also gave me the chance to prove something I had spent 6 years wishing I could prove, and it gave us this." He gestured to the porch around them, to the sleeping infant in her arms, to the sounds of Thomas and Charlotte laughing somewhere inside the house. "I do not know that I would wish the fire away, even if I could, strange as that may sound." "It does not sound strange to me," Margaret said. "I have thought much the same thing myself, though I confess I feel some guilt in thinking it, given how much the town lost that night." "The town rebuilt," Milton said. "Stronger, if Elias Frost is to be believed, and I think he is right more often than not on matters of this kind. Sometimes the hardest fires clear the ground for something better to grow. I do not say that lightly, Margaret, knowing what fear that night caused you and Charlotte both, but I have come to believe it true nonetheless." Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, and Milton wrapped his arm around her, careful of the sleeping infant between them, and they watched the last light fade from the sky together, the same way they had watched countless sunsets in the years since that first fire, each one a small quiet reaffirmation of the life they had chosen to build from what could so easily have been ashes and loss instead. "I refused your hand once," Margaret said softly, after a long, comfortable silence. "I have thought over these years that it was perhaps the single greatest mistake of my life, and yet I cannot fully regret it either, strange as that sounds, for it led me to Thomas, and Thomas gave me Charlotte, and without that path I would not have the daughter I love so dearly. And yet it also led me to nearly lose everything in that fire, and led you back to me in the exact moment I needed you most. I do not understand the shape of fate sometimes, Milton, but I have stopped trying to understand it so precisely. I only try to be grateful for where it has brought me." "That seems a wise way to hold it," Milton said. "I spent years being bitter about the shape fate had given me, and I do not think the bitterness ever once served me well. It only kept me from admitting how much I still hoped, somewhere beneath all that pride, that a chance might yet come for us." "And it did come," Margaret said, smiling up at him in the gathering dusk. riding hard through smoke and flame, no less. I could not have dreamed a more dramatic second chance if I had tried Milton Warren. I am not certain I would recommend the method to other couples seeking reconciliation, Milton said dryly, and Margaret laughed, a warm, unguarded sound that still, after 5 years of marriage, sent a small thrill through him every time he managed to draw it from her. Inside the house, Charlotte called out that supper was nearly ready, having taken it upon herself, with the confident bossiness of an 11-year-old given responsibility, to help her mother manage the household's evening meal, and Thomas's small feet could be heard pounding across the floorboards in whatever game he had invented for himself in the interval, since his sister's cooking lesson had begun. "We should go in," Margaret said, though she made no immediate move to do so, content for one more moment in the quiet evening air with her husband beside her. "In a moment," Milton said. "I find I like standing here with you, watching the light go down, more than I like almost anything else in this world." "Even more than your cattle," Margaret teased. "Considerably more than my cattle," Milton said, and kissed her softly, mindful of the sleeping infant between them. And together they stood a while longer on the porch of the home they had built from the ashes of an old sorrow, watching the last color drain from the sky and the first stars begin their slow climb above the wide Wyoming plains, before finally turning, hand in hand, to go inside and gather their family for the evening meal. The warm light from the windows spilling out across the porch behind them like a promise kept. The years that followed brought their own share of ordinary hardships. A difficult winter in 1885 that tested the resilience of every rancher in the territory. A brief scare when young Thomas fell from a fence and broke his arm. The slow ache of watching Charlotte grow from a girl into a young woman with dreams of her own, dreams that eventually, when she turned 18 in 1890, took the shape of a courtship with a young schoolteacher who had come to Cedar Hollow to take over instruction at the town's growing schoolhouse. A courtship that Milton watched with the particular mixture of pride and quiet anxiety that fathers, even stepfathers who had come to love a child as fully as their own blood, seem universally to feel. Charlotte married her schoolteacher, a patient, kind young man named Daniel Ashford, in the spring of 1891, in the same church where Milton and Margaret had exchanged their own vows 13 years before, and Milton walked her down the aisle himself, since Thomas Kingsley had not lived to see his daughter grown, and Charlotte had asked Milton, with tears in her eyes, if he would do her the honor, given how thoroughly he had earned the title of father in every way that mattered beyond blood alone. "I would be honored beyond anything I can properly say," Milton had told her, and on the day itself, walking her down that same aisle, past the same pews, beneath the same simple wooden cross that had witnessed his own marriage to her mother, Milton found himself overwhelmed by a swell of feeling he had not fully anticipated, a father's pride so complete it left little room for anything else. Margaret and Milton went on to have one more child together, a second son named William, born in 1886, rounding their family to 5 children total when counting Charlotte among them, though by the time William arrived, Charlotte was already nearly grown and Thomas well into the rambunctious energy of boyhood, so that the household, while full and often chaotic, never felt burdened by its size, only enriched by it. Warren House continued to prosper through the years, becoming something of an institution in Cedar Hollow, known throughout the surrounding territory as a place where a traveler could find honest lodging and a warm meal regardless of the season. And Margaret, in the fullness of middle age, took on something of a mentoring role among the younger women of the town, many of whom sought her counsel on matters ranging from managing a household to navigating the particular hardships that came with life on the frontier. A role she filled with the same quiet strength that had first drawn Milton to her decades before. Milton's cattle operation grew steadily as well, though he never sought to expand it beyond what he and his hired men could manage with proper care and attention, having learned early in life that Ambition unchecked by wisdom led more often to ruin than to lasting success. He served for a time on the town council alongside Elias Frost, and was known throughout Cedar Hollow as a fair and steady man, quick to lend a hand to any neighbor in genuine need, a reputation that stood in sharp and satisfying contrast to the dismissive judgments some in the town had once passed on him as a young man without name or land to his credit. In the autumn of 1898, 20 years to the season since the great fire that had brought Milton racing back into Margaret's life, the town of Cedar Hollow held a special commemoration, for by then the fire had become woven into the very fabric of the town's identity. A shared memory of catastrophe survived, and community strengthened through shared hardship. The town erected a small plaque near the site of the original feed store, listing the names of those who had lost buildings in the blaze, and honoring the collective effort that had seen the town rebuilt stronger than before. And at the unveiling ceremony, held on a crisp October afternoon with the cottonwoods along the creek turned brilliant gold, Elias Frost, now considerably grayer but no less given to sentiment, asked Milton and Margaret to say a few words. Milton, now nearing 50, his dark hair well threaded with silver, his hands weathered by decades of ranch work, stood beside his wife, who had aged into a graceful, contented middle age, her own hair showing streaks of gray she wore without vanity or complaint, and looked out over the gathered townspeople, many of them faces he had come to know intimately over 20 years of shared community life, and found himself, as he so often did on occasions of importance, searching for words adequate to the feeling rising in his chest. 20 years ago, he began, I rode into this town not knowing whether I would arrive in time to save the woman I loved, or whether I would arrive only to find that fate had already decided the matter without any regard for my hopes. I have thought many times since about how differently my life might have gone had that drifter at the way station not mentioned Cedar Hollow's troubles to me, had I not happened to be within riding distance, had the fire caught even an hour sooner than it did. I do not know why fate arranged things as it did, only that I am endlessly grateful it did so. He paused, looking at Margaret, who stood beside him with tears standing bright in her eyes, tears of happiness rather than grief, and continued, This town lost much that night, and I do not wish to minimize that loss by speaking only of my own good fortune in finding my way back to my wife. But I think there is a lesson in what this town accomplished afterward, in how thoroughly you all rebuilt, not merely the buildings that had burned, but the spirit of the place itself, stronger and more generous than it had been before. I came to this town 20 years ago a man with very little to offer beyond my own 2 hands, and whatever love I still carried for a woman who had once, quite sensibly, refused those same 2 hands as insufficient security for her future. This town gave me the chance to prove that love, joined with hard work and patient devotion, can build something as lasting and as valuable as any fortune in land or cattle. I am grateful to Cedar Hollow for that chance, more grateful than I know how to properly express, and I am endlessly grateful to my wife, who took a chance on love the second time that she had been too frightened to take the first time, and who has never once, in 20 years, given me cause to regret that either of us made that choice. Margaret spoke next, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her expression. I refused Milton Warren once, she said, because I believed a woman alone in this territory could not afford to choose love over security, that practicality must always win out over feeling if a family was to survive the hardships of frontier life. I was not entirely wrong in that belief, and I do not regret the marriage that followed, which gave me a good home and a beloved daughter and years of genuine contentment with a good man. But I learned, in the ashes of that terrible fire 20 years ago, that security and love need not be opposing choices, that a man who loves deeply enough will work hard enough and stay steady enough to build the very security a woman fears she must sacrifice love to obtain. Milton Warren proved that to me in the space of one desperate night, riding through smoke and flame to reach us, and he has continued proving it every single day since, in 1,000 smaller ways that matter just as much as that first dramatic ride. I am grateful beyond words that this town gave us the chance to find each other again, and I hope every young woman here, facing choices of her own, might learn from my example that love and practicality need not be enemies, if only she is fortunate enough to find a man willing to prove himself worthy of both. The gathered crowd applauded warmly, and Elias Frost, ever sentimental, was seen wiping his eyes with a large checkered handkerchief, and the ceremony concluded with the unveiling of the plaque itself, a simple bronze marker set into a stone base, listing the date of the fire and the names of the buildings lost, and beneath that, a line that Elias Frost himself had insisted on adding. Over the mild objections of the town council who worried it strayed from proper civic commemoration into overly sentimental territory. From these ashes, this community rebuilt not merely its buildings, but its bonds of love and neighborliness, stronger than before. That evening, after the ceremony had concluded and the townspeople had dispersed to their homes, Milton and Margaret walked together along the creek at the edge of town, the same creek that had, 20 years before, provided some of the water that the desperate bucket brigade had used to fight the flames, though it flowed now peaceful and unremarkable in the gathering dusk, its banks lined with cottonwoods shedding their last golden leaves into the current. 20 years, Margaret said, watching the leaves drift past on the slow current. It hardly seems possible when I think back on that night how much time has passed since. And yet it also feels as though it has always been this way, Milton said, as though we have always been married, always had our children, always lived this life together. I find I can barely remember most days what it felt like to be a man without you in his life, though I know I spent 6 long years exactly that way before the fire brought us back together. I am glad you cannot remember it easily, Margaret said. I would not wish that particular ache on you, even in memory, not after everything since. They walked in comfortable silence a while longer, the sounds of the town settling into evening behind them, lamplight beginning to glow in windows along the main street, the distant lowing of cattle from Milton's modest herd carrying faintly on the cooling air, and Milton found himself, as he so often did on quiet evenings like this one, simply grateful, deeply and completely grateful, for the strange and improbable turns that had brought his life to this particular point. Standing beside this particular woman, having built this particular family and this particular home out of the ashes of an old sorrow and a night of terrible fire. Do you know, he said finally, I think if that drifter had never mentioned Cedar Hollow's troubles to me at that way station, I might have gone my whole life never learning what became of you, never knowing whether you were happy, never having the chance to prove to you or to myself that the love I carried all those years was worth something after all. I think of that sometimes, how close I came to never having any of this. But you did learn of it, Margaret said, taking his hand as they walked. And you did ride, and you did prove it, and here we are, 20 years later, with 3 children between us and a home that has weathered fire and hardship and come out stronger for having survived it. I do not think we ought to dwell too long on the paths not taken, Milton. I think instead we ought to be grateful, every single day, for the path we did take, however strange and however nearly it came to not happening at all. You are right, as you so often are, Milton said, smiling. I married a wise woman, it seems, along with a beautiful one. Flattery, Margaret said, laughing, will get you exactly as far as it always has, which is to say, quite far indeed, given how thoroughly I have always been susceptible to it from you specifically. They returned home as the last light faded fully from the sky, to a house full of warmth and lamplight, and the sounds of their children, Thomas now 17 and full of restless ambitions of his own regarding the cattle business. He hoped one day to inherit and expand. William at 12 already showing signs of his father's steady patience and his mother's quiet strength. And Rebecca, now 15, deep in correspondence with a young man from a neighboring ranch whose intentions Milton suspected with the particular wariness of a father watching a daughter grow toward womanhood, would need careful watching in the coming year or two. Charlotte and Daniel Ashford, with their own 2 young children, had come to visit for the commemoration ceremony, and the whole family gathered that evening around the large dining table Milton had built himself years before, made from good sturdy oak that had aged into a rich, warm color over the decades of family meals it had hosted, and Margaret served a supper of roasted chicken and fresh bread, and preserves put up from the summer's harvest. And the conversation ranged easily from Thomas's plans for expanding the cattle herd to Charlotte's eldest child's recent success in school to William's earnest, if not entirely convincing, argument that he ought to be permitted to accompany his father and brother on the next cattle drive, given that he was, in his own estimation, nearly a grown man himself. Milton, sitting at the head of that table, looking around at the faces gathered there, his wife beside him, his children and grandchildren filling the space with warmth and noise and love, found himself thinking, not for the first time, that whatever hardships the frontier had demanded of him over the years, whatever losses and struggles had shaped the long path of his life, he would not trade a single moment of it, not one. If the price of avoiding those hardships meant losing any part of the life that had grown from them. After supper, when the children had been settled for the night and the house had grown quiet, Milton and Margaret sat together on the porch that wrapped around Warren House, the same porch Margaret had once dreamed of owning long before fate had given it to her, then taken it in fire, then given it back again through the devoted labor of the man beside her, and they watched the stars emerge one by one over the wide Wyoming plains, the same stars that had witnessed their reunion 20 years before, the same stars that would go on witnessing whatever years remained to them both. "I love you, Margaret Warren," Milton said, using her married name deliberately, savoring the particular satisfaction it still gave him after 20 years to speak it aloud. "I loved you as a young man with nothing to offer you but hope, and I love you now as an old man, or nearly old, with considerably more to offer but no greater depth of feeling than I carried then, for I do not think the feeling itself could have grown any deeper than it already was, even in the earliest days of our acquaintance." "I love you too, Milton Warren," Margaret said, resting her head against his shoulder as the stars brightened overhead. "I am endlessly grateful that fate gave us a second chance, wrapped though it came in fire and terror and loss. I would not undo any part of it, not the fire, not the years apart before it, not the fear we both felt that terrible night, for every part of it led us here to this porch, to this family, to this life we have built together. I only hope, whatever years remain to us, that we might spend them exactly as we have spent these past 20, together, grateful and endlessly in love." "I intend to see to it personally," Milton said, and kissed her softly in the starlight. And there, on the porch of the home they had rebuilt from ashes, surrounded by the sounds of their sleeping children within and the vast quiet plain stretching out beyond, 2 people who had once let fear and practicality separate them found themselves, 20 years later, more thoroughly and completely bound together than either could have imagined possible on that long-ago night when Milton Warren first rode, hard and desperate, into a burning town to save the woman who had once refused his hand, and found, in doing so, not merely her rescue but his own long-delayed happiness, and hers besides, happiness that would carry them both, hand in hand, through all the remaining years of their shared and richly ordinary life together. The years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of seasons on the frontier, and as the new century approached, Cedar Hollow itself had grown from the modest cattle town it had once been into a proper settlement with its own bank, a second church for the growing Methodist congregation, and talk, increasingly serious, of a railroad spur that might one day connect the town more directly to the wider markets beyond the territory. Milton, now gray-haired and moving somewhat more slowly than the vigorous young man who had once ridden 2 days without rest, had turned over much of the daily work of the cattle operation to Thomas, who had grown into a capable and level-headed rancher in his own right, while Milton himself took increasing pleasure in simply being present, watching his family and his adopted town continue to flourish around him. Margaret, for her part, had begun to slow the pace of Warren House's operations as well, hiring on help from among the town's younger women to manage the daily labor of cooking and cleaning, while she herself took on more of an advisory role, still beloved throughout Cedar Hollow for her wisdom and her warmth, still sought out by younger women navigating the particular challenges of frontier life, marriage, and motherhood. In the spring of 1901, with the century freshly turned and the whole territory abuzz with talk of statehood negotiations and the changing shape of the American West, Milton and Margaret celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary with a gathering that brought together nearly the entire extended family they had built over the decades, Charlotte and Daniel Ashford with their now 3 children. Thomas married by then to a young woman named Sarah from a neighboring ranch, and expecting their first child together, William, at 26, courting a schoolteacher of his own in a pleasant echo of his elder sister's romance years before, and Rebecca, married and living some 30 miles distant, but returning for the occasion with her own husband and young son. They gathered at Warren House, the same building that had risen from the ashes of that terrible fire so many years before, now expanded twice over to accommodate both the boarding operation and the growing needs of the family itself. And Elias Frost, well into his 70s by then, but still sharp-witted and sentimental as ever, offered a toast that drew warm laughter and no small measure of happy tears from the assembled company. "I have watched this family," he said, raising his glass in the warm spring evening, "grow from a single desperate act of love into something that has, in its own quiet way, become the very heart of this town." Milton Warren rode into a burning Cedar Hollow 23 years ago to save a woman he loved, and in doing so, he saved something of this town's own spirit as well, proving to all of us that love, properly tended and bravely pursued, can weather any fire this hard frontier chooses to throw at it. I do not know that Cedar Hollow has ever produced, nor will ever produce again, a finer example of devotion than the one these two have shown us all these many years. To Milton and Margaret Warren, and to the family they built from ashes into something altogether more beautiful than what came before. The toast was met with warm applause and the clinking of glasses, and Milton, looking around at the gathered faces of his family, his children and their spouses and their children in turn, felt his heart so full he could barely find words to respond, and so he simply raised his own glass in acknowledgement, and turned to look at Margaret beside him, her hair fully silver now but her eyes as bright and warm as they had been on the night he first climbed a burning staircase to reach her. "To Margaret," he said softly just for her, though the words carried in the quiet evening air to those nearby, "the woman who once refused my hand and who I would ride through any fire, any distance, any hardship to reach again, exactly as many times as it took. You have already proven that, Milton Warren," Margaret said, smiling, her eyes bright with the particular happiness that comes only from decades of shared devotion successfully weathered. "You need not prove it again. Though I confess I am glad, every single day, that you did prove it when it mattered most." And there, surrounded by the family they had built together from the ashes of an old sorrow and a night of terrible fire, in the town that had once judged Milton Warren unworthy, and had come, over the passing decades, to embrace him as one of its own most beloved sons, two people who had found their way back to each other against every practical expectation, continued to live out the long, warm, richly ordinary happiness that their extraordinary reunion had made possible. Grateful every single day for the fire that had, against all reason, given them back to each other, and for the love that had proven, in the end, stronger and more enduring than any hardship the wild frontier had seen fit to throw across their path.